Hey, Vanilla, look what I found.
What does it do?
I don't know, let me test it out.
Oh!
Hi again, guys, and welcome back to Doomsday Prep Class. Today I want to talk about some of my favorite nuclear close calls. A while ago I mentioned there was a whole Wikipedia page filled with times we almost blew up some nuclear bombs. And after reading that article, the fact that some of these scenarios are how thousands of people narrowly avoided getting atomized is unfortunately really funny. And hey, fears over nuclear annihilation are at their highest in decades, so why not make it worse? Part of what makes Kwite videos fun is all the fear-mongering. If you enjoy this bit of existential dread of a video, there will be this big card at the end that you can click or tap to take you to another one like it. It would be really manly and forward-thinking of you to do that, I think. Let's start off with just a well-loved fan favorite, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Definitely a bruh moment in history. Step over, Hank Green, it's time for the first history crash course of the video. In the early 60s, America had some of those big nuclear penises of theirs in Italy and Turkey near the Soviet Union. And the Soviets, for some reason, were not too happy about that. And between that and the recent Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, they agreed to give Castro some of their own nuclear bones to put up there. And thus began the highest stakes dick measuring contest in human history. A few missiles had already got to Cuba and had facilities being constructed for them when JFK was all like, hey, knock it off. And he decided to quarantine, which is another word for blockaded without that pesky baggage of being an act of war, saying that he wouldn't let the Soviets send any more offensive weapons to Cuba, also telling them to pull out any nuclear Johnsons they already had in the country. It was one tense, passionate, long sword fight of negotiations. One of the commanding Soviet officers who just did not have good communication skills almost blew his load too soon. He readied up a nuclear shot thinking that we had already gone to war, but his buddy talked him through it and got him to calm down, listen to Daddy Moscow for new orders. That went on until the Soviets agreed to pull out by the end. Can you believe I took the sex metaphor this far? Anyways, as a result, a direct line of communication between Washington and Moscow got established, and the relationship was so much stronger for it. That's the big one that most people know, so I figured it was best to get it out of the way. Now, moving on. I think one of my personal favorites is one that I relate to a lot. In 1969, some folks were ordered to load up nukes on some fighter jets and to plan a strike on the DPRK, that being North Korea. That was before eventually being told to stand down. I know that all nuclear close calls are scary by default, but this one was relatively mundane. If it wasn't for this one little detail that the president at the time, my good buddy Richard Nixon, was a little bit of an alcoholic. It's unconfirmed, but reports go that this guy was shit-faced when he gave that order, and the person who called it off was his Secretary of State. Essentially, that guy was the president's designated driver for his term in office. What was the scenario in the White House like that day? Nixon's just sipping his 5th gin and tonic, and he's like, you know what would be a funny bit? Just dropping a nuke somewhere, literally anywhere. He sloppily throws a dart at a map. It lands on North Korea, and he's like, yeah, that'll work. And you know, it was really bad for this guy in general. Not only does he have like a hole stabbed through his face, this dude is essentially my spirit president, because in the last few weeks of his presidency, he was clinically depressed. That whole Watergate thing seemed like it really stressed him out. Talk about cancel culture going too far. Nixon, it's okay if you take a break from content. We'll all still be here when you're ready. Regardless, another one of his cabinet members, his Secretary of Defense this time, essentially said, hey guys, if Nixon sends out any emergency orders, just run it by me first, just to be safe. Something like, I don't know, maybe a nuclear launch order, not for any particular reason, just cause, why not, you know? This next one's interesting because of how many mistakes happened at once to make NORAD think we were about to get invaded and needed to respond with nukes. During the Suez Crisis, they got a bunch of reports all at once. There were supposedly a Soviet fighters over Syria, a Soviet fleet was making some unexpected gamer moves in the Black Sea, an unknown aircraft had flown over Turkey, and a bomber was mysteriously down. But every single one of those ended up being wrong, like a blank, cumless orgasm. Some of the things these potential threats ended up being was a scheduled Soviet exercise, a British bomber having mechanical difficulties, and a fucking wedge of swans being the aircraft over Turkey. I understand swans are terrifying. They can apparently break a person's arm using their wings only, and are just generally closer to being Pokemon than real animals. But treating them like weapons of war seems like a bit of a jump. In 1960, equipment in Greenland saw a moonrise coming up and was like, yeah, that's a nuke. I don't know how it works. It could have been an easy mistake to make. I'm not gonna look into it. But people thought it was probably just like a bit though, because Nikita Khrushchev, the at that point Soviet leader, was literally in New York. It would kind of be dumb to nuke the enemy coalition while you're still in the damn place. You know, sipping whiskey or whatever it is world leaders like to slurp on. Lean, maybe? A lot of these have come from Wikipedia so far, and while I've certainly learned a lot, there's even more incidents than than even the ones they've listed here. I don't know if it counts as a close call, so to speak, but back in 2014, an 84-year-old nun named Megan Rice, alongside a few others, broke into a nuclear power plant. And when they got inside, they splashed baby bottles of human blood onto the walls of the bunker. It was like a protest kind of thing, and there wasn't any real danger from the shit that they did. It's just the fact they were able to get in at all that's scary, considering it's probably tough for her to go at more than a brisk walk, and what they decided to do when they got inside. You might be thinking, man, it's crazy how often we almost blow up our population centers. There's been so many close calls, it's a wonder they haven't actually gone off for real once. The people running that stuff must know what they're doing if we made it this far. And I'm sure some of them do, but it's way more entertaining to cherry pick all the reports we have of people not being good at their jobs. It was nuts, because in 2003, one half of the Air Force units in charge of our physical nuclear weapons failed their safety inspection. And it wasn't like a surprise landlord visit either, where they get out their bloodhound nose and sniff down your flat for cum stains. They failed even after they had an advance warning that the inspection was going to happen. To be fair, that was like 20 years ago at this point. I'm sure that was some kind of wake-up call, and that failures like that are way less common nowadays. Never mind the failed safety inspections in the years after, like in 2013, and the government just giving the fuck up in 2017, where they made test results off limits to the public. That's probably unrelated to the high failure rate. Probably just a coincidence, if you ask me. That's all like big number stuff, though. I think the real fun ones are the times where it feels like people just forgot they're in charge of handling nukes, where some of the scenarios that get described sound like they come out of a version of The Office set in a nuclear silo. Back in 2016, there was this one time that 14 Air Force troops meant to protect nuclear weapons were being investigated for doing drugs on the job. Supposedly, they were in part being probed for cocaine usage. Listen, I'm all for getting swifty and legal and responsible ways on your free time. Keyword, your free time. Was there really no better opportunity to back a quick line than when you and your boys were chilling inside the nuclear bunker? One time in 2007, 6 nuclear-armed cruise missiles got put onto a B-52 bomber on accident. It's an easy mistake. Everyone's done that at least once. This was despite multiple checks you're supposed to do to make sure the missiles aren't armed, and they were left alone and unguarded for pretty much a day and a half until a maintenance crew saw them and were like, wait a second, those are... This isn't so much a nuclear close call as it was a nuclear false alarm. There's a lot of overlap if you think about it. But do you remember back in 2018 when Hawaii got that false alert? Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. Only to get blue-balled because it pretty much was a drill. People were shitting themselves and panicking all over the state, which, like, fair enough. But the one thing I could never stop thinking about was Jim Carrey's apparent reaction where he supposedly got the notification and thought, I don't want to die in my car. So he got out to stare at the ocean in his final moments like the main character he probably is. Bro probably had a come the fuck on moment when the all clear was given. I had the drama set up perfectly, and he's just fuming that he didn't get his at peace with the world ending. The worst part about that whole thing is that it was all because someone misclicked a button. A mistake I make every time I try to weapon switch on Doom Eternal made an entire state think it was about to get pulverized. The person who did it was meant to press a button that sent a test alert, which was put right next to the button that sends out a real alert. Apparently they did it because they missed the part on the phone call where the person higher up on the chain specifically said that this was an exercise. Moving on, let's talk about a funky little guy named David Hahn. He was a Boy Scout of America and created a neutron source in his backyard when he was 17 years old. People have been calling him the Nuclear Boy Scout, and it's like they wanted him to keep doing that shit if they were gonna give him a nickname that goes that hard. Marketing motivates movement, people. Basically, a neutron source, according to the article I stole this explanation from, because God knows I don't know what that is off the dome, is any device that emits neurons. They're used in lots of things, from nuclear bombs and power to medicine. It's a very versatile type of doohickey, from what I understand. In general, David ran his own chemistry experiments because that stuff was fun to him, and they were, quote, liable to make small explosions, which makes him sound like a cartoon character. David just thought it would be sick if he made a nuclear reactor in the shed of his mom's backyard, so he grabbed and pilfered radioactive material from everywhere he could. Batteries, smoke detectors, fucking gun sights, and used it to essentially try and jerry-rig his own nuclear reactor together. Long story short, that bitch was not a reactor, but it was pooing out radiation levels that you could measure and were 1,000 times higher than background radiation levels. He saw those radiation measurements and was like, oh no, that's not good. He started taking apart the experiments himself, but then in a coincidence, the police ran into him and were all like, hey bud, what you doing in there? His Johnny Test lab got shut down by the EPA and his mom's house got turned into a super fun radioactive cleanup site. And even after all that mess, David still decided not to get screened for radiation exposure. What a Chad, going his own path in life. Do not follow in his footsteps. You may have recently seen a quirky little article about a Florida man who got arrested for using a lost nuke to power their house for 27 years. I could not find a reliable source for this, unfortunately, because that sounds really funny. But if we're talking nuclear close calls to scare the shit out of ourselves, let's talk about some calls we can't even say are close, because they're still out there technically waiting to happen. It turns out the United States and other countries have managed to misplace more than a few nukes since they first got invented. It happens enough that we have a term for it, so-called broken arrows. Seems like an understatement. There is, of course, the one that I mentioned in North Carolina in a previous video, where a B-52 crashed and dropped the nuclear bombs on board, where one of them only didn't detonate because of a single switch not going off in the activation sequence. But what I didn't know is that apparently there is a second bomb still chilling in a swamp with part of its nuclear payload still down there. I know I've spent a lot of time dogging on America for how bad we are at just taking care of nukes like nurturing parents should, by putting it out of its misery. But don't get me wrong, the Soviet Union were pretty shitty parents back when they were around too. In 1968, a Soviet nuclear submarine malfunctioned and sank to the ocean floor, unfortunately killing everyone on board. The CIA saw that and was all like, shit, sounds like there might be some good intel down there. So they started salvaging the wreckage, but we don't even know if they picked up the nukes during that whole thing. Another time in the 70s, a Soviet submarine had 2 uncontrollable fires start and it sank to the bottom of the ocean with its crew and 4 more nukes. These guys are really going for a record on this. It happened another time in the 80s, where another Soviet submarine, ironically called a Yankee, had a massive explosion, and after a failed rescue attempt, brought that hunk of metal, its crew, its nuclear reactor, and 16 ballistic missiles with 2 nuclear warheads each down to the ocean floor. And hey, why not one more for the road? In the late 80s this time, the Soviets lost another nuclear submarine to the bottom of the ocean. A tragic loss of life happened in every single one of those. Something about Soviets and nuclear submarines, man. If there's one question you take away from this video, it's probably, how are we not dead yet? And on that very uplifting note, I'm gonna wrap this up here. I hope you guys enjoyed. This is a bit outside of what I normally do. If you did like stuff like this, please let me know. I would be interested in exploring the format more. Regardless, that card I mentioned should be on screen now. Remember, don't go after any of the lost nukes I mentioned in today's video. This was all in good fun, and I'm pretty sure owning one is a crime. If you enjoyed, like and subscribe with notifications on. This has been Kwite, and I have an inspection to fail.